The overall question we want to address is whether science communication research, SCR in short, has matured to be called a field in its own right. And if so, like any other research field coming of age, should we then ask which are the patterns that have characterized its developments over the decades, which topics are or have been what we probably call trending nowadays, and which methodologies are used. So this is what motivated this in-depth field analysis we're discussing today. To avoid misunderstandings, the idea was not to criticize SCR for, let's say, potential shortcomings or to take the glass is only half full approach. Instead, this is an empirical analysis to enrich the discussion that would otherwise or has otherwise often been limited to opinions about what we are doing, should be doing, should not be doing, should not be focusing on. So it's an empirical underpinning, and we've done our best to share those results and recommendations as widely as possible. Study has been published as an ebook, fully open access, as an audiobook, and you have the link actually down here. There has been a blog post, A Public Understanding of Science Online, a Twitter storm with somewhat 20 little episodes, and a series of webinars, this year being the second one today. If you intend to tweet, as Jenny already said, please consider using the hashtags. And you can also use our Twitter handle here. That's the Institute for Science and Innovation Communication Center, where I'll be responding in person about this event. I'll be summarizing the main points from the study in, let's say, the coming 20 minutes, as indicated below, starting with the methodology. On the right-hand side, also our project team, and including the external advisors. Well, for the first time, this bibliometric analysis coded the actual content of more than 3,000 scholarly publications. It wasn't just analysis of who published or where things were published. We used for that 7 different samples. 4 of them were actually total population ones. And for comparative reasons, we deliberately went beyond the 3 core SciComm journals that came to mind first and foremost when we asked those, I believe, 36 international experts to rank the most relevant outlets in the field. That's why we added Nature, Science, and even the Scientific American here. And in addition, also we included this selection of 79 so-called major works, a volume edited by Brian Trench and Massimiliano Bucchi. The list on there shows the distribution and the ranking of those experts of the journals. And doesn't even include journals such as Frontiers in Communication, for example, which I believe is now among the leading ones, which at the time wasn't really a thing, even when we started the analysis a couple of years ago. So with tens of thousands of project reports, which may also need to be mentioned, and conference proceedings, books, blog posts, I suppose we need to add today, we could only really scrape the surface. There's literally a big data challenge for which both a purely semantic approach and a keyword search had previously proven methodologically insufficient, which is why we have been thinking a lot about how to continue from here. This is why the follow-up project to our first field analysis is now taking a machine learning approach in which we will use the, let's say, intellectually coded data from this study here to calibrate an automated categorization of thousands of other papers and documents methodologically that should be comparable in terms of reliability, which of course is fundamentally important, and additionally then extending the scope to much more multilingual analyses, which is also important to include Spanish and Portuguese, Mandarin, Japanese, to mention just a few. So this is what we're talking about today is also just an important first step on a journey. The gray literature is a pretty bottomless undertaking, as already said, because there's just so much more, and that particularly comes from the project reports, of which there are so many out there. And as I said here, the big data approach will define the follow-up project. Without further ado, of course, the content analysis conducted on the quantitative side was calibrated with a randomized and stratified sample of about 7% of the data. Then we calculated the intercoder reliability at the end of what were 9 research assistants coding and calculating, and we used Krippendorff's alpha here on a nominal scale at the time. And obviously not just looking for which journal published under which title and author in which country, but also, and that is where vast amount of the work came in, that every individual paper, everyone several times was coded for variables such as the context in which it appeared, the discipline, the methods being used, and so on. You can again see how that triangulated up there in the overall methodological design. We also included some 2 online surveys, the great literature analysis, which I was mentioned just now, and 2 series of interviews. Because then, of course, we wanted to contextualize all of that. And again, this is a who's who list on there, which doesn't just reflect and represent leading experts in the field, but also, as far as I understand and hope, also the international global diversity of the fields. Our study provides evidence that science communication research has matured as an academic field. Not only has the absolute number of journal papers increased significantly, particularly in those last 15 years of analysis, but this is especially the case for research studies, compared, for instance, to commentaries or essays, which still are common, but the proportion of those research studies has increased over from a median of 24% before the year 2000, where we only had 7 research studies in total, to a median of 37%. Since 2000, that was 43 studies in total. What is higher than ever before is the variety of institutions, techniques, variety of disciplines in SCR, which contributes to the field's diversity, which we may need to discuss because it may also indicate a lack of maybe a clear theoretical framing. Our study has then identified here those 10 we called grand challenges. Let me just zoom in a handful of those in the interest of time, because we want to have time to discuss. The first one here is that most research papers have reported one-off studies, compared to only 3% having a longitudinal design, a proportion that has even declined in the past 5 years. So pre-post studies seem to be the limit for longitudinal design. You could say this is why the study asks if the field is constrained by cross-sectional work on the use of certain tools, certain cultural contexts for certain research areas, which of course limits the generalizability of the endeavors to some extent. More longitudinal, more comparative, more systemic research. So what the study argues is therefore needed to understand how contents and channels interrelate, how actors and audiences interrelate. So do not look at individual aspects, but ideally at all of them at the same time, or many of them. This will most likely also require more openness regarding the methodology, such as the use of data mining to analyze large data sets, which for the time being is also something that we don't really see in the field. As multidisciplinary as it is, the fragmentation also comes with the risk of being caught in established disciplinary structures and habits. The scientific communities such as media studies, marketing, sociology of science, social psychology often use quite different jargon. They present their results at different conferences. They publish in different journals. These opportunities of an interdisciplinary integration, which obviously is different from the multidisciplinary nature of the field. So the integration of different research traditions does not really seem to be seized yet, which is what we are also recommending then in the study. On the other hand, we could also ask whether that multidisciplinarity is a call for reducing fragmentation, which seems the obvious reactionary approach, or whether it is about learning how to deal with the diversity of the field, which is, I think, fundamentally different. Let me zoom into another one quickly here. In addition to these inner academic challenges of different traditions and disciplines, the field is also affected by a second and potentially much more significant disconnect, and that is the one between scholarship and practice, which hasn't been compared to other disciplines as of yet, but that's another thing that needs to happen next, that we make sure that we also understand how that compares to other fields in social sciences and probably even beyond. So you have scholarship and practice, neither of which takes sufficient notice of the other's priorities, challenges, and solutions, resulting in quite a significant untapped potential for transfer, for collaboration, for more application, implementation of those solutions, even experimentation and action research to be conducted together by scholars and practitioners, as we've seen it, for example, with these tandem research funding programs in the US, where a practitioner and a scholar together apply for a grant. What we've mentioned here, in addition, is also the Manifesto for Evidence-Based Science Communication, which makes specific suggestions how those transfer mechanisms could and should be redesigned. One of the important additional aspects raised there is that an empirically robust understanding of what we're doing, maybe should be doing in SCR, does not necessarily answer the question about the actual research needs in practice. So we can analyze for ourselves as long as we want what we are doing and should be doing and discuss it academically, but that doesn't mean that we systematically analyze what the practitioners community really needs us or would need us to do in addition or less or more or a different way. This would require an analysis. For example, we could and should be looking through associations, newsletters such as Excite or RedPop that are discussing at their events and in the newsletters and websites, and ideally even engaging with this community of practice directly to bridge that gap. The original Anglo-American leadership in SCR is still, let's say, a myth that's being conveyed that this is all UK and US. That has been rendered history by the field analysis. Contributions are much more globally diverse nowadays, although overall the long established dominance of particularly those two countries over several decades, of course, still have their legacy. If you look at the top 20 institutions with the largest SCR outputs over time, then there's just one institution which is not located in the US or the UK, 19 of them in those two countries. But having said that, prior to 1995, institutions from just 10 countries contributed to those 3 core SCR journals in any one year, less than 10. Whereas 20 years later, in 2014, articles, which was when it peaked, articles were written by authors from 37 different countries, which is always almost 4 times as many. So we have a diversification of a global authorship, particularly the share of publications by authors from Europe has increased. Figures for the past 5 years, for instance, show that Europe, with 51% of the overall output, is well in front of North America, which is now at 29%. It goes without saying that this distribution would look entirely different if we were to base it on a multilingual data set, which we couldn't and which we haven't yet. So this is only basically just a bird's eye view on SCR in the apparent lingua franca. We also need to discuss the flip side of that. If we have different publication cultures, for example, in Latin America, in India, in Japan, in China, on SciComm, then there could be a potential risk of isolation for scholarship exclusively published in other languages, which again is something that may need to be bridged. The other one I wanted to quickly zoom into, because we are going to discuss it also in more detail today, is that our study showed that SCR does not necessarily look at the entire spectrum of research. That's also the graph and the tweet, which by far outnumbered anything else we've communicated about this study on social media, even though it has been misinterpreted as nobody's reporting on math, nobody's reporting on the earth sciences, which is where most of the tweets came from. But this is what are the disciplines that the social scientists, that science communication research focuses on. And you can see here a very clear tendency towards biology, here environment, so life sciences at large, And that is even the trend that has increased and not decreased. From these expert interviews, from the research literature analysis, our study has also concluded how and why SCR potentially falls short of addressing those grand challenges. And we summarize those in 4 research gaps. The first one, that's systemic changes into digitalized media to be understood, includes recent debates about post-truths and data-driven mass manipulation. In general, science communication often appears more relevant when topics are more controversial. So all of that would need to be analyzed in more detail. New intermediaries in SciComm include pseudo-journalistic media platforms, while independent checks and balances in a democratic sense are replaced. You speak of disintermediation and re-intermediation here. SCR could analyze these systemic changes and experiment with alternative models, including business models. We indicated here that the question, what are policy impacts of all this communication out there, this cacophony, and how can we measure, how can we compare them, including the political influence from pressure groups, formal science engagement for statutory regulation, for example. And fourth, the research funding organizations have expressed that they need more reliable methods to evaluate and compare the role of SciComm in funding calls, what to expect in grant proposals, the specification, and the project outcomes when it's being evaluated. Examples could be RRI, Responsible Research and Innovation in the European context by the European Commission, the REF in the United Kingdom, transfer projects in Germany, and so on. But there are also examples, obviously, in Australia and in South Africa and many other countries. And only then could we fairly and transparently manage and monitor SciComm as part of the research. Yeah, and all of this basically is reflected then in the open access research field analysis in research recommendations. Just maybe as one example, what you will find then is that these are the methods used, and whereas you would maybe expect an increasing diversity, you see that most of the studies in the field still work with surveys. And that led to policy recommendations, which basically said that we need to build the corpus with effective transfer mechanisms, and something that has also been expressed by the Evidence-Based Science Communication Manifesto. We need to establish well-resourced science communication research hubs, of which there are not even a handful in the world. And we need to increase internationalization and inclusion of global perspectives